and this. And in the event of an alarm, you'll know it's happening, and please just gather up your valuables and go outside. It's so windy, I'm not going to tell you to go 3 blocks to McNeely Park. I would suggest Starbucks, where it's nice and warm and toasty, or some other public building. Please obey traffic signals and be careful when crossing the street, particularly when people are evacuating the building, and a little bit excited about it. I also need to let you know that this meeting is going to be webcasted and recorded, so please speak into the microphone when you come up to speak, and I'll try and do the same. It's hard to do. Also note that the camera that we usually have is broken, so it's very exciting. The camera is fixed, so never mind. And please be sure to turn off or set on stun any of your cell phones and beepers so as not to disturb the proceedings. Okay, with that, we're on to the public forum, and the board will hear from any person wishing to speak about any matter that's not pending before the board. Is there anyone? No cards. Okay. Next, the board will consider the minutes from the March 19th board meeting. I'll entertain a motion.
Move approval.
Second.
Okay, moved by Steve Moore and seconded by Fran Spivey Weber. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Oh, one abstention. You weren't here. Okay, great. Got it. All right. Any of my colleagues have any reports to make? Interesting meetings? Observations? Okay. Good. All right. First will be item number 3, uncontested. Any board members like to make a motion on item number 3?
I'll move for adoption of the item.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, great. Mr. Howard, item 4.
Yes, this is a follow-up to the series of workshops the board's had on Bay Delta. We have some of our Bay Delta staff here. Diane Riddle, Rich Sikowski, and Aaron Mahaney will be presenting.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, Vice Chair Spivey Weber, and board members. I'm Rich Sikowski, a senior engineer with the Division of Water Rights. And with me at the staff table today is Diane Riddle, Environmental Program Manager, and Aaron Mahaney, Senior Staff Counsel. This technical information is on the next steps for the draft summary report on the technical workshops in support of the comprehensive Phase 2 review of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. This morning I'll briefly go over the Bay Delta planning activities and turn it over to Dr. Brock Bernstein, the facilitator of the Bay Delta workshops. As has been discussed at the workshops and meetings, the planning efforts for updating the Bay Delta plan has been distributed into 4 phases. All these phases are related and will be informed by the other phases. Real briefly, Phase 1 includes the review and update of the San Joaquin River flow objectives for the protection of fish and wildlife, and for the Southern Delta water quality objectives for the protection of agriculture. Phase 2, which is the subject of today's agenda item, includes the comprehensive review and update of the Bay Delta plan focused on fish and wildlife purposes, not including the San Joaquin River flows, which are part of Phase 1. Phase 3 includes modifications to water rights and other requirements needed to implement the changes from Phases 1 and 2. And finally, Phase 4 includes the development and implementation of flow requirements for priority Delta tributaries. To assist the board in gathering and assessing the technical and scientific information related to the comprehensive review of the plan, the board held 3 two-day workshops. On September 5th and 6th, 2012, we had a workshop on ecosystem changes in the low salinity zone. On October 1st and 2nd, 2012, a 2-day workshop on Bay Delta fishery resources. And finally, on November 13th and 14th, 2012, we had a workshop on analytical tools for evaluating water supply hydrodynamics and hydropower effects. On January 2nd, 2013, Dr. Bernstein, in cooperation with ICF International, released a report summarizing the workshop's key points, including areas of agreement and disagreement, sources of a disagreement, and degree of uncertainty. On February 28th, March 29th, and again on April 5th, 2013, notices of this informational item were sent to the Bay Delta LIRIS list. The State Board is specifically not requesting comments on the individual workshop summaries themselves in the draft report, but instead input on the next steps in this comprehensive process. So the State Board is specifically requesting input on what, if any, areas of uncertainty identified in the summary report should be resolved during the comprehensive review of the Bay Delta Plan, and what process should be used to resolve those issues. So that's it. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Brock Bernstein, the facilitator of the Bay Delta workshops, who will provide a summary of the summary report. And then following Dr. Bernstein's presentation, Dr. Peter Goodwin, lead scientist for the Delta Stewardship Council Science Program, will present the science program's recommendations related to next steps.
Am I on? Yes. Thank you very much. It's nice to be back. So most of you sat through, excuse me, most or all of the workshop presentations, and then you've had available the summary report, which goes into some detail. So I won't recount that here. What I'll do is just try to hit the high spots and set the stage for Dr. Goodwin, who's going to sort of present some ideas about looking forward to what to do with this massive information that you've all received. Whoops, crap. Okay, now I'm... Oh, roll the wheel, thank you. There we go. So Rich Setkowski reviewed some of the background, but I wanted to emphasize a couple of things. One is the second bullet point, which is that the focus of the workshops was on scientific input related to fish and wildlife beneficial uses. And of course, even when focusing on those, the discussion and the presentation materials went over into other details like hydrology and habitat and all that, but the focus was still primarily on fish and wildlife. And the basic intent was not to try to answer questions, but to provide a wide range of stakeholders as good an opportunity as possible to provide input to you, and then to allow you an opportunity to engage them in back and forth. So we structured the workshops to provide for a fair amount of time for discussion and Q&A. Rich reviewed the workshop charge, but I also want to emphasize that again, the charge for each workshop to the stakeholders who wanted to participate was to focus on scientific and technical issues, and then to the extent that management was relevant in terms of how to use that scientific information, then to focus on certain aspects of adaptive management, but not to focus on it from the perspective only of management, but to start with the science and to see where that led us. We ended up talking in workshop 3 a lot about modeling and data analysis, and there were the workshops had a somewhat different focus. Workshops 1 and 2 were primarily on the biology, and workshop 3 was primarily on hydrology, water management, electricity generation, and the models and tools needed to manage that sector. There were overall over 120 participants in the 3 workshops. Not every interest group participated in every workshop. For example, the California Energy Agencies only participated actively in the 3rd workshop, but the majority of these participants were here for all 3 workshops, and so there was a very wide range of participation. As Rich mentioned, the workshop report is available online. There's 2 major sections to the report. The first section, which is brief, 10 to 20 pages, is a facilitator summary that I prepared. Following that are detailed summaries of each presentation and each workshop, including nearly verbatim descriptions of the discussion that the board members had with the participants. So if you want to go back and refresh your memory about how somebody responded to a particular question you had, if you have that amount of time, you're free to do that. The report that I produced tried to focus on areas of agreement and disagreement, and where the uncertainties were and where the questions were. And a lot of the questions were ones that came from you all, things that you thought were important to pursue and that were not necessarily resolved in the workshops. There were a really wide range of topics addressed. And you can see everything from how to resolve scientific and management conflicts to how to use adaptive management and how to use modeling and what sorts of modeling tools might be available. Not all of these received an equivalent amount of attention. Excuse me. Some, like flow, for example, received attention through all 3 workshops. Others, such as invasive species, only cropped up in a couple of places. Nevertheless, all of these issues were described as somehow being interconnected and interrelated with at least 2 or 3 others. And so one of the take-home messages from the workshops was, as you probably know by now, having dealt with this for so long, is that it's very, very difficult to take any single issue out of this larger context. And that's one of the things that makes this such a difficult system to work in. And so while there was some general agreement on the core issues and their relative importance, there was much less agreement on the specifics of how they worked, how they related with other factors, what the cause and effect relationships were, how complicated they were, how amenable they were to intervention by human action, what the outcomes would be of alternative policies, how those alternative policies should be developed, whether they should be adaptive in nature or not. So there was a lot of disagreement about all of that. On the other hand, there was also a lot of agreement that given the complexity of the system and the remaining uncertainties in the science, that some sort of an adaptive management approach was called for. And I think there was almost unanimous agreement on that. Obviously disagreements about where the experiments should be, the scope of them, who should be on the winning or losing side of those experiments. If, for example, additional water or additional habitat should be moved around to conduct those experiments. But there was really, I think, pretty unanimous agreement that we couldn't just sit back and look at the system and analyze data from routine monitoring studies. We had to actually get in and do some experimentation and do some adaptive experiments to see what would happen and then use that to help inform management decision making. So as the invited panel described in the first workshop, these are really wicked problems, and they're notorious across the country and around the world for having these characteristics. They have, like we mentioned, lots and lots of interacting factors. Not only do they interact in complicated ways, but they never sit still. They move around through space and time. There's sea level rise, there's climate change, there's increasing human development, all sorts of things that make it very difficult to predict what will happen if we do something. In addition, everybody has somewhat different interests. There's lots of competing perspectives. There's lots of different stories about what's happening, and so it's very hard to get any sort of a consensus about what's really going on and what we should do. And as we talked about a lot in all through the workshops, I think it was a recurring theme through all 3 workshops, is there's this relatively immature and undeveloped link between science and management. And I know that was a keen interest that you guys had through all 3 workshops, is how to improve the link between science and management and how to better coordinate the multiple, sometimes parallel and duplicative scientific efforts that are going on in the Delta with all the different processes. And I think Dr. Goodwin is going to talk a little bit about that. And so the next steps, I think, is where we're at, and I talked a little bit in the summary report and the facilitators report at the beginning about what the next steps might be and what the pros and cons might be of various options. This isn't the first time that management entities have faced these kinds of problems, and there are a number of different kinds of processes and structures that people have put in place to try and deal with these sorts of problems. So what I got from lots of conversations with stakeholders in preparing for the workshops and talking about the results of the workshops was that there really is a very broad awareness among the stakeholders, state and federal agencies, environmental groups, the water suppliers and contractors, cities. There's a really sort of fundamental agreement that they're fatigued with this persistent kind of what some of them call combat science, that they understand there's conflicts. They understand some of the conflicts come from the science, some of them come from their interpretations and perspectives, but there's a pervasive sense of fatigue with that and a desire to do something or maybe try something a little different. So as you heard during the workshops, there was a lot of support for the invited panel's call for some sort of more collaborative science on the scale of the Bay Delta as a whole. There was a lot of willingness to work across institutional boundaries. Some agency representatives even had to go check with their managers in Washington, but all came back and said, yeah, we'd be willing to participate in something. We're cautious. Some were more enthusiastic than others, but all of them were willing to do something that might build on what the workshops had established. But they didn't identify a specific mechanism for collaboration, even though a couple of different ideas had been batted around. So if you need more detail, there's that summary report available, but that was the extent of what I had to offer today. Thank you.
Any questions? All right. You'll be hanging around, though. So we can come back to you. All right, great. Let's just get through the presentations then.
Okay, so I up next. Well, good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. It's a pleasure to be back in front of you and trying to give a summary, at least from the Delta Science Program's perspective, and giving some advice on ways forward. What I'd like to do, first of all, is just introduce Sam Harada, who has been the lead from the Delta Science Plan on interacting with your staff through this process, particularly putting together the invited panels. And I'd just like to re-emphasize those invited panels, the care that was put in assembling the panels to make sure it was truly representative of all of the various interests. And then when those panels came together, it was quite remarkable the amount of care and effort that went into those recommendations. So we did not ask for consensus opinions. We wanted a statement of what is known right now and what should the priorities be. So you'll see, particularly on one of the panels, there was a minority opinion that was very clearly articulated. And I think that's just, on that particular topic, it was very real and it was very well argued on both sides. So Sam's going to be walking through the thoughts about where we are in the science program, but I just wanted to make a couple of generic comments. First of all, I'd like to compliment Brock Bernstein and your staff, because this is a difficult thing to do. But I think what they've managed to amass is this very high-level synthesis of the range of issues and where you are right now. And I think the value of the 3 workshops that were put forward has given you a very rich material to build on that expresses people's opinions, but much more importantly, that you often don't see in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Most of those opinions are backed up with a lot of scientific information and very solid recommendations. So we feel that there's a lot of solid material to build on as you move ahead with a science basis for this. What it's also done, it's been very helpful for us in the science program, because we've been struggling through the science plan on how do you establish a common body of knowledge, because the issues that you're struggling with, you could probably cite at least 6 or 7 similar planning processes that are going on where there's massive overlap. And so this has been very helpful to us. So how do you build this common body of knowledge that's been inclusive and transparent, and people can actually see how decisions are being made, what the uncertainties are, what might be the risk associated with various decisions. So we think it's been very valuable. I think it's also important to recognize, and looking at some of the letters that have come in the last couple of days, I think it captures the challenge that you're facing very well. And that is that science is not an endpoint. Your science is a journey. And as Brock very eloquently said, whether you call it a wicked problem, a grand challenge, you've got that in very large measure here. And so we are part of a journey. And so the question that you had posed to us and most of the other panels, is there sufficient information to move ahead, or are new studies warranted? I think what our recommendation is, and based on many of the speakers that testified before you during those hearings, is that if you do move towards this adaptive management process that allows this continuous injection of new knowledge as the process continues, there really is not much to be gained by further delays. So we're not suggesting that there's new studies, but what we are going to suggest is that based on the information that's already been collected, following the recommendation of the National Academies report in the middle of last year, and the emphasis that they placed on synthesis, we identified a few areas where a lot can be gained by a formal process that pulls together that diverse knowledge into a more solid format that identifies where we are right now, what we know. And I think one of the things that you come away from with the workshop, we know an awful lot compared with other systems. But there really are truly legitimate, or areas out there of legitimate scientific disagreement, and we're always going to have those. So to have a clear articulation of that, to have a clear articulation of the uncertainties that are out there as you make decisions, and then to have a process about how we begin to address those disagreements through competing hypotheses and trying to coordinate some of the research scientific dollars that are out there. So our suggestion is to pull these key areas together into a solid document where people can respond and comment. You use that to move ahead, but also at the same time thinking about what sort of adaptive management process that will allow you to continue on this journey of science and inform your decision making into the future. And so Sam's going to talk a little about these focused synthesis activities, and again I want to stress it's not all across the board. I think we've identified 4 areas that are really where most of the discussion is going on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sam, and you can correct me if I misstated anything, and perhaps give a summary from both the science program. No, I think we're good, both from the science program, but also what we learned from those members of the invited panels who gave up Saturdays and evenings and many other things. So Sam.
All right, thanks. I never disagree with Peter. He's the lead scientist, so I have to do what he says. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these are our staff, Delta Science Program staff recommendations for some possible next steps. These are based on both the experience with the independent review panels, other work that the science program has done, and Dr. Bernstein's summary report, which really helped to pull all that together. I think while the expert panels that we organized provided some of the best thinking on current science on the subjects of the workshop, I think some of the topics and the issues discussed in the summary report would benefit from a more thorough process for identifying and synthesizing that best science. So we have a few recommendations on those focused areas. One thing we think would help is that a workshop process similar to what the Delta Science Program has done with other topics would help, and we're proposing that we could help host a series of workshops that would be somewhat independent from the state board. We would work with state board staff to hold those workshops, but these would be done more in a similar way that we do our workshops and our scientific reviews. So based on the workshops, we think there are really 4 issues, as Peter suggested, that should be the primary focus, and a lot of other things will be brought into those. So these will be the core of those discussions. But one is delta outflow requirements to protect the estuarine ecosystem. And there are basically 2 flow issues. One's delta outflow. The other is interior delta flows designed to protect salmonids. And for the flow issues, we think those should be the focus of a couple of workshops, or maybe a few more, one or two more, depending on how we shape up. The other issue we think is an important one is nutrients, and we're proposing that we continue to work with both the regional board and the San Francisco Bay Regional Board and the state board on their development of nutrient criteria for the Delta, and we'll work with them on both workshops and on a more collaborative science process to inform those decisions. The other topic that we think is important is invasive species. We think that jumped out, and in particular the issue of the invasive clams in the Delta, and that seems to be a major problem for the estuarine ecosystem. And one thing that's come out to us as staff is that it seems like there's a lot of effort and put in towards prevention of invasion by new species, and we think that's important, but we also think there could be some more effort put in towards managing the species, the invasive species that we have now, and we don't see that there's been a lot of effort put into investigating whether there are ways. For example, the invasive clam, the overbite clam, has appeared in South San Francisco Bay for a number of years and then disappeared, and there's some ideas, some hypotheses about why that happened. But we really don't have a good answer for that. So they can be controlled, and we probably need to understand how that might be possible. I just feel like sometimes we give up on that issue when we should put more time and effort into that. So we would, in summary, we would propose to help work with the state board staff on those 2 workshops on the flow issues, and work with the regional boards and state board on the nutrients issue, and suggest that maybe the state board could help suggest to some of the other state agencies that they could work more on the invasive species issues, the existing invasive species. One possible approach to those workshops on the flow issues would be to work with staff to develop some scenarios or potential alternative flow scenarios. And we think that while that might be a little controversial, but it helps to focus the science efforts. So then we can give scientists a particular specific alternative to focus on, and then they can apply models and give the board feedback on uncertainty associated with those models and risks involved. And I think that will help you make a decision based on the best science that we can bring to those issues at this time. And then also work with you on how to structure an adaptive management program to follow up on those issues. So, questions?
Can I just add
Sure.
one additional comment before we get to questions? And it's also very important, I think, to recognize that in addition to these 4 issues, there's already workshops or processes to look at other important scientific issues. And so we're suggesting that as your staff move together with these 4 areas, it's done in conjunction with this broader sciencescape that's going on. So, for example, in particular with predation, there's a very robust process being put together right now. And so the outcomes of those workshops should obviously be included within this, and it's probably an area that you can use that information without actually having to make that a major focus, because there'll already be a synthesis document coming out on the time frame that you need.
Question? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for both the summary and the recommendations. And I especially appreciate Peter's comment about there not being a need for delay. So given that comment, my question to you, Sam, is what is your thought regarding the timing in holding these workshops, doing the scientific review, and providing thoughts and recommendations to the board?
It would be my sincere hope that we could finish that up sometime this summer. That would fit in with other work that we have, but maybe that's too optimistic. But
Always be optimistic.
But I think the advantage of the process that we use in our workshops is that we pull that information together, and and get a synthesis product put out in a fairly short period of time. I think it helps to, rather than delay the process you're doing, I think it really helps to accelerate it. I think this is similar to the process that the state board staff would be going through in developing recommendations. But I think we bring in the power of outside scientists and scientists working within the system and harness that a little more quickly and can get a synthesis product to you that's a finished product in a fairly short period of time.
One thing that we have in our favor is that there was a tremendous amount of effort to review science, up to the present for the workshops. And so doing something like this before that starts to become, obsolete with new studies would be really important. So a lot of the grunt work has already been done in terms of assembling and reviewing the past science. And there's a lot of written material. And so I think Sam's right that, building on that before too much time goes by is probably important.
Yeah, go ahead.
This question is for Richard or for Tom. In terms of, you're hearing this as well. I assume you had a preview. And basically that we do not need to stop or slow down or wait. Do the two processes, does that sound rational to you in given your workload? And Tom, you've been through this many times over the last couple of decades. So I just want to make sure that we're being, while perhaps optimistic, and that's good. I'm very optimistic, but with a dash of realism that I just wanted to kind of know what to expect. So I don't want to slow the staff down because of these workshops.
No, I think that that would fit nicely into the scientific basis report that the water board staff are working on presently, and would help to inform that reporting process, and that sounds like a valuable contribution to me. Diana is...
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I think it might resolve some of the uncertainty and disagreement that we have surrounding issues. That
Right.
we have the independent review from an expert panel that can help to facilitate resolution of some of these issues. So I think we're also in favor of this idea.
Thank
Right. Right.
Well, first of all, I would favor further workshops because it would help me to get up to speed. There's quite a bit that I've missed. But I agree also, workshops are always very useful ways to get the stakeholders to further collaborate. There's all that discussion that goes on formally and then also informally during workshops. So I would favor that. One of the things that, and again, this could be because I haven't been involved as closely as you all, but maybe to hear more about some of the other studies that are going on elsewhere. I believe, Sam, you mentioned predation. And no need to delve into it much further because there's plenty going on elsewhere. Opportunities for us to hear from those folks in perhaps a more formal setting, whether it be a workshop or an informational briefing. BDCP, not everything about BDCP, but areas where there might be some overlap, Delta Stewardship Council. And then one recommendation that I do have, and I'm not quite sure exactly how this should go forward, but I read through the report. It was a good way for me to learn about the workshops without having actually been present, but the common theme was adaptive management. And I just really appreciated that it came up in so many different settings over and over again, but I kept circling it with a question mark, what exactly is meant, because it almost seemed that folks have a different view of what exactly is meant by adaptive management. And depending on how an adaptive management program is structured, it could provide for maybe bookends for certainty, or perhaps greater uncertainty if not structured properly. And so I just think it might be helpful just to have a workshop on adaptive management, ways to structure exactly what the goals are, what's going to be the adaptive part versus the not so adaptive part in an adaptive management program.
You know, I have a comment that might be helpful. Maybe Sam could describe what he means by workshops, because I think it's helpful to clarify that he's not referring to a workshop before the state board necessarily, but a science panel review workshop. So Sam?
Yeah, I think that's probably helpful. So when we do our workshops, typically we'll try to get a planning committee together to plan out the workshop and think about questions that we want to ask an independent panel. And we typically write up questions for that panel. We have a charge that those questions are to the panel. We usually put the burden on the lead scientist to approve that charge and who the members of that review panel or workshop panel are. And we do that not in that planning goes on in usually they're fairly open meetings, but we don't do this in a public meeting. And when we hold the workshop, we generally have part of that planning process is always to identify presentations, what information is going to be provided to that panel. We do have opportunity for stakeholder participation in that planning process. We value their input and have them, be active participants in planning the workshop. And when we actually hold the workshop, we do that in public setting. Most of the workshop is in a public setting. We have a public session. We usually find a venue for it somewhere, in a big enough space we think will accommodate the workshop. We usually have some time during a 2 or 3 day period for that panel to go off and talk amongst themselves. Then the panel comes back, presents their initial thoughts, and the people that provided presentations, the scientists who are providing the information to them, have a chance to interact with that panel to clarify any misunderstandings. And so by the end of the workshop, the panel has a pretty good outline of what they're going to say in their report. They've had a chance to have some interaction with the people presenting information, and if the state board staff there with the state board too, staff. And then we send them off. We give them 30 days or so to come up with their final report, do some minor review of that report, usually editorial, factual kinds of issues. And then they have the final cut of their report, and the report is the report of that panel, an independent panel, and that's what we would provide back to the board.
And I'd just like to comment that that's the exact same process the National Institutes of Health has used for years to deal with medical controversies, and so it's a tried and true process.
Yeah, it's very similar, yeah.
Can you speak to how you arrange the panels, the expertise from, throughout the country in some cases and other areas?
Well, there's a lot of thought that goes into identifying who's on the panel. We do our best to get as independent as scientific views, and we want scientists who have considerable stature. We first identify what the areas of expertise are that we need for that panel. And we'll do that working with the planning committee, and we take suggestions on who's on the panel from the planning committee, which will include stakeholder representatives and representatives from the agencies. And generally pull together a panel of 5 to maybe 7 at the most, independent experts. We take some care in kind of reaching a balance of independence, their scientific background and knowledge, And then we usually want to have one or two members of the panel that also have specific knowledge of the Delta system or the local system question involved. So that geographic kind of experience is really important too.
Just a quick question. Sorry, Stephen. I'll pay you. You said these were open public meetings, so I assume we're free to drop by, with the only caveat being that if 3 of us shows up, then do you publicly notice these meetings?
We publicly notice the
Okay.
meetings, yes.
I guess you wouldn't mind putting in a little sentence about perhaps a quorum of the board might be there.
We certainly could, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
I know that's great, and presumably when the report is done, we could come back and do another meeting here of the summary of what you came up with. So there's an opportunity for using our process and venue as well.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, we would see this as complementing or, supplementing the board's process rather than being any substitute for it. So we're hoping this will help to take that next steps towards synthesizing that flood of information that you have in front of you now and getting some additional thought on drilling down to some of those more specific issues.
Great, and then we would presumably also be able to do workshops in our format on things like adaptive management. However we want to frame the question in a series of conversations, essentially with the public, so that we have a collective thought process going on.
Yes.
Great, Steve.
Oh, yes, thank you. Well, it's gratifying to hear that all the effort that our staff and all the stakeholders and the scientists put into our 6 days of workshops, and of course Brock's excellent summary has been fruitful from a perspective of really providing a foundation for collaborative science and to help inform decision making. I think there's a logic to this process. As Brock noted, it's a model that's been used. And I think we want to have that patience of drilling down to the next level. And my initial response to the areas is favorable. I think it makes sense to touch on these 4 areas. I'd be curious what other folks think of that, if there's other areas that warrant drilling down more. I wanted to just point out, because it's what I studied, my background in nutrients, and just wanted to remind everyone it's not just a matter of what the discharge regulation for nutrients is from whatever source, but also what biogeochemical functions are provided through restoration activities in concert with other functions. So that nutrients is very complex, but really as we envision the estuary of the future, we want it to be productive. We want constructive productivity, not destructive productivity. And so I think nutrients is a key nexus of our, let's say, authorities, the things we get involved in with respect to whether it's the flow or what's in the water. And I really want to emphasize, this process that is underway on the nutrient numeric endpoints statewide, and how this state board before I was here really made a concerted effort to have a science-based, adaptive-based framework for the development of nutrient endpoints, and not just have a number to oversimplify, some of the pressure we were receiving several years ago. So I just think it's great for us to look at nutrients, but not just in terms of regulatory, but in terms of the investments we make in the development of functions that create more sustainability, and that select for native species. And, on the third point, invasive species, or fourth, sorry, invasive species, very interesting to me because I was on the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force for 4 years, 10 years ago. I'm very familiar with many stories out there of preventive or controlling spread of species, or really just minimizing the impact. What management approach do you take to it? The Potamacorbula amurensis clam, that's fascinating to hear. You might actually be able to control spread. I think it's worth looking at, but we also have to manage expectations. So, again, I think we have to select for native species. So I just want to encourage this format. I'm obviously interested, as Tam pointed out. I hope to be able to attend some of these workshops, but I certainly want to empower. I want to empower this process to sort through the details, and I just appreciate where this is going. And I think congratulations to staff and fellow board members of doing this process, of making it open and transparent. But let's keep it in a timely fashion too. Let's continue to move ahead, build on the momentum created by these workshops to, as you say, pull all the information into one place. And just can't overemphasize the importance of synthesis, not just within disciplines, but between disciplines. Thank you.
Well said. We say the name of that clam again?
I don't know if we're talking about the same one, but yeah, it's had a lot of names over the years. We called it Patama corbula, you know, but now it's Corbula amurensis. It's from the Amur River between China and Russia, and it invaded the estuary in 1987.
I think they went to Corbula and then back to Patama corbula, somewhere in between anyway.
Go ahead.
Two more comments. One, I think Dee Dee's request for a list of the other processes. I mean, you're right in the middle of them. We really aren't, or probably our staff is, but the board isn't. And it would just be helpful to not every process, but the key processes. And you mentioned the one about invasives, but there probably are a few others that are going on within BDCP and that we just, aren't aware of. So it'd be nice to just have a list. And secondly, I assume climate, as you choose your participants in your various workshops, you're going to choose people, or at least give them information that so that they realize that they're planning for a dynamic future that we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. So I just want to make sure that that's on the record, that that's an expectation that we would have from these panels.
Thank you. Can I just add one other comment about the time frame?
Time frame, and then if you can also comment on the ability to just give an overview, because one of the issues people have raised is the fact that we have science going on in different fora and they don't seem connected. And I completely agree with Fran and Dee Dee's points about the need to sort of have that overall framework of what's happening. And if you can also mention a little bit, just for the sake of people listening, the predation workshop that's going on, because until I ran into you on the train, I didn't realize that a robust effort was actually happening at the same time. So it would be nice, just for clarity, to get a sense of where things are happening and where we're adding value. Part of what I like about doing this is that's exactly why the Delta Science program is there. And so us figuring out how to work with you is what was intended when you were created. So I'm happy that this seems to be working out so well.
Great. With that was a great idea, and I think to have a sort of map of the sciencescape, what's going on, what's coming up. And perhaps if I could make one quick advertisement. Clearly there's a lot of interest from the board in the science issues. And I would just draw your attention that the week of April the 22nd, there's the QEMF IEP annual meetings, which are traditionally run back-to-back. So QEMF, you heard from several of their members in the third workshop. That's the California Water and Environmental Modeling Forum. They meet the Monday to Wednesday. Wednesday to Friday is the IEP, the Interagency Ecological Program. And there's always an overlap day on the Wednesday. So I would encourage you, if you want to get up to speed or just mix with some of the most influential scientists on a more informal basis, that's a great meeting. I believe it's on Thursday evening. There's a poster session in particular, and there's going to be, before that, a discussion on the concept of collaborative science and what it means in the Delta. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening during the week, and I'm sure on behalf of IEP, if anyone, or QEMF, if any of you are able to make it even for part of the meeting, you would be more than welcome. Great. The other thing I just wanted to comment on was the time frame, and just to give a reality check with my other hat on, and I think that the real value from what I've seen of these workshops over the years is it allows for a very in-depth discussion between some of the top scientists in their field, sometimes even internationally, with the science leaders here in the Bay Delta. And so it's really important to make sure that at those workshops the right people are there in the discussion. And so we're just going into the summer with primarily field season for the biologists and the vacations. So from the academic perspective, late summer, late August, early September is a great time because people are back in their offices getting prepared. But I think it's not that the staff isn't willing or the Delta Science program isn't willing, but I think we probably need to come back with a schedule, or the staff need to come back with a schedule of what's really realistic given some of the very major field programs that are going on this summer here. So I still think we can get there with the time frame that you've been talking about, but just the actual date of the workshop and making sure that the material is there, it's well informed, is probably more important than trying to get everything done by August.
How about, do you mind giving a summary of the predation panel just for everyone who's listening?
Actually, and perhaps I'll pass to Sam because,
Right.
again, he's been running that series.
We're working with the Department of Fish and Wildlife on doing what looks like now to be a series of workshops. And they're really focusing on fish-on-fish predation and focus on salmonids for this series of workshops. So we've been working with them for several months now, and that's one thing to point out. In these workshops, the planning part usually takes longer than the actual workshop part. That's really where all the effort is. And the first workshop that we're planning to hold, where Fish and Wildlife is planning to hold, is probably going to be in June. They're got their drop dead date from their management. And that workshop is going to be focused on what we know about fish-on-fish predation in the system. It's based on what scientific information and data is out there and what studies. The second workshop will be looking at what does modeling tell us? What do the life cycle models for those fish species tell us about the importance of predation? How does that really affect the species that we're concerned about? The third workshop will then actually get to what everybody wants to talk about. What are the management alternatives for dealing with predation? So we've worked with them and looked at the issues and with Fish and Wildlife and suggested that they really split that subject up into those three separate parts. And I'm not sure when the second two parts of that are going to be, but the first one is probably going to be in June.
Great.
So.
Great. Thank you. For now? All right, will you be able to stick around for a while this morning? Yeah. Terrific, thank you very, very much. It's very encouraging. Next. Is this it? Oh yeah, there have to be more. A couple of quick housekeeping while we're waiting, going through the comment cards. We have some people who've asked for a little bit of extra time, but not a lot. I'm not going to do an estimate, but the whole room won't be speaking, just so you know. So my suggestion is going to be that we go ahead and take the comments on this item in this ongoing discussion, and then we'll take a short break before we move into the next topic, two topics on the agenda, just so people know who I know are already here for the next item. But I think this item is going to, I don't know even how to estimate, it's not going to take 2 hours, but it may take a little more than an hour, and I suspect we'll have a lot of questions for the speaker.